Hank sat at the kitchen table, sipping on his coffee, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. It had been a normal Wednesday morning until his phone buzzed, lighting up with a message from his friend, Mike. Subject line alone made his blood run cold. "Jenna, you need to see this." His heart hammered as he tapped the screen, and what he saw next shattered his world. There they were, his wife, Jenna, and her boss, Tom, locked in an embrace at what looked like a conference hall, their lips inches apart, eyes alight with desire. The next photo showed them kissing. Hank's throat tightened as a wave of betrayal swept over him. He scrolled further, his hands shaking. The videos were worse, Jenna laughing, playfully swatting at Tom's arm, leaning into him. Another video caught them in a corner, their heads close together, whispering intimately. Mike's message followed, "I didn't want to be the one to tell you, man, but I couldn't let you be in the dark." This was at last night's conference party. Everyone saw. Hank's coffee mug slipped from his hand. He would confront her, but not yet. First, he needed a plan. Hank spent the rest of the day in a fog, his mind churning with rage and disbelief. He'd always trusted Jenna, had always believed that their marriage, while not perfect, was built on a solid foundation of love and respect. But now, staring at the damning evidence, it was clear he had been a fool. How long had this been going on? Was it just a fling, or had she been playing him for a fool for months, maybe even years? He couldn't just storm in and confront her, not yet. His mind raced through the possibilities. If he confronted her now, she'd lie. He knew Jenna too well. She was clever, calculating even. If he gave her any hint that he knew, she'd start spinning stories, coming up with excuses, and dodging the truth. No, he needed more than just a confrontation. He needed to unravel her lies, to expose her completely. He decided he would gather more evidence. Mike had sent the photos and videos, but Hank needed something undeniable, something Jenna couldn't squirm out of. He pulled out his laptop and began researching spyware, programs that would allow him to monitor her phone without her knowing. His stomach turned at the thought of spying on his wife, but then he remembered the image of Jenna kissing Tom, the way she smiled at him like she used to smile at Hank. The pain was sharper than any physical wound, and the thought of betrayal burned hotter in his chest. He wasn't spying for the sake of control, he was seeking justice. By evening, he had everything set up. Jenna was working late, probably with him. Hank thought bitterly, but she would be home soon. He installed the monitoring software on her phone while she was in the shower, his hands trembling slightly. Part of him wanted to vomit, but the other part, the colder, more calculating part, was fueled by a new sense of purpose. He needed to see everything. He had to know the truth. When Jenna finally came down for dinner, she was all smiles. Hank watched her closely, nodding in all the right places. But inside he was analyzing every detail, every movement, every false note in her voice. Her phone buzzed a few times during dinner, and she casually glanced at it, smiling before placing it back down. But who was she texting? Tom, no doubt, Hank thought, his blood boiling again. He gripped his fork so hard his knuckles turned white, but he forced himself to keep calm. He couldn't let her suspect anything yet, not until he had more proof. After dinner, Jenna kissed him on the cheek and headed upstairs, saying she had some work to catch up on. Hank watched her go, his heart pounding. She was so good at pretending, so good at living this lie. He needed more time to uncover the full extent of her betrayal. As soon as she was out of sight, Hank grabbed his phone and started tracking her messages. The texts were exactly what he feared. There were dozens of them, going back months. Sweet messages, dirty jokes, plans for secret meetings. It wasn't just an affair, it was a whole other relationship. Jenna had been living a double life, one where Hank was just the background character and Tom was the main event. Hank's hand shook as he scrolled through the conversations, each new message hitting him like a punch to the gut. But he knew he couldn't stop here. He needed more. He needed to catch them together. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about reclaiming his life, his dignity. He had a plan, and soon Jenna would see just how far Hank was willing to go. The next few days were a blur of carefully concealed rage. Hank played the role of the loving, clueless husband, all while his phone fed him a steady stream of Jenna's deceit. Every morning, she left for work with a kiss on his cheek, and every evening she returned with that same practiced smile, the same casual conversation about her day. It was maddening how easily she lied, how effortlessly she carried on her life as if nothing were wrong. Hank watched, listened, and waited. He knew now that her affair with Tom had been going on for months, hidden beneath the thin veneer of business trips and late nights at the office. The messages between them were enough to make Hank's skin crawl. Tom telling her how much he missed her, how much he couldn't wait to see her again. Jenna replying with the same warmth and passion she once reserved for Hank. And the worst part, the way she belittled him in her texts, making jokes about Hank's boring life, how clueless he was. Hank felt like he was living in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But instead of confronting her, he gathered his strength, focused on his plan. He had to time everything just right. Bursting in without all the pieces in place would only give Jenna the upper hand. No, Hank had to be smart. He had to be patient. He wasn't just looking for a confrontation. He was setting the stage for her complete downfall. Then, the opportunity came. Jenna mentioned another conference, another work trip with Tom. She tried to keep it casual, but Hank had already read the messages. This trip wasn't about business at all. They were planning a weekend together at a hotel just outside the city. Hank forced himself to act normal, pretending not to notice the excitement in her voice as she talked about the stressful meeting she had coming up. Hank's heart raced with a combination of fury and dark satisfaction. This was it. This was how he would catch them. The night before the trip, Hank sat on the couch, pretending to watch TV while Jenna packed upstairs. His mind was spinning. He had everything set up. He'd hired a private investigator to follow Jenna and Tom, to take pictures, to document every moment. The investigator would trail them to the hotel, snapping shots of every kiss, every touch, every piece of physical evidence he could get his hands on. It wasn't just about proving the affair to himself, it was about destroying her. He could already see it, Jenna in court, blindsided by the evidence. Her lies crumbling, her carefully constructed life falling apart in front of her. She'd never see it coming. Hank would make sure of that. Jenna came downstairs, her suitcase in hand. "I'll be back Sunday afternoon," she said, giving him that same fake smile she'd been using for months. "So I'll miss you?" Hank smiled back, forcing every muscle in his face to obey. "I'll miss you too. Have a good trip, babe." As the door clicked shut behind her, Hank's smile disappeared. He grabbed his phone and called the investigator, confirming the plan. Everything was in place. He'd let her go, let her believe she was getting away with it one more time. But this would be the last. That night, Hank barely slept. His mind replayed the years of their marriage, the good times, the laughter, the intimacy that now seemed like a distant dream. He wondered when Jenna had started slipping away from him, when their life together had become something she felt she could throw away. But those thoughts were soon replaced by a darker resolve. She wouldn't get away with this. Not anymore. By the time Saturday morning rolled around, Hank was ready. The investigator sent updates throughout the day, tracking Jenna and Tom as they arrived at the hotel, confirming they had checked in together. Each message felt like another stab in Hank's heart, but it also strengthened his resolve. Now it was time to act. Hank picked up his keys, feeling the weight of what he was about to do settle in his chest. There was no turning back now. He was going to confront them, and this time Jenna wouldn't be able to lie her way out of it. Hank drove in silence, the weight of his plan pressing down on him. The closer he got to the hotel, the more his heart raced, not with doubt, but with a steely sense of purpose. And he wasn't the same man he'd been just a week ago. That version of himself, the trusting husband, the devoted partner, was dead. The new Hank, the one speeding toward a confrontation, was colder, more calculating, and driven by the need for justice. As he pulled into the hotel parking lot, his phone buzzed. A message from the private investigator. "They're in room 212. I've got everything. Photos, videos. You want me to send them over?" Hank paused for a second, his fingers hovering over the screen. He was tempted to ask for the proof, to make sure he had it all in his hands before going up there. But no, he didn't need to see more. He'd already seen enough in the texts and videos, enough to know that Jenna was in that room with Tom, doing things they could never come back from. This confrontation wasn't about seeing the act, it was about ending the charade. "No, hold off for now," Hank replied. "Just be ready." He stepped out of the car and walked toward the hotel entrance. Each step felt heavier than the last, but his mind was clear. He was about to blow up his life, but the destruction was necessary. Jenna had made her choices. Now it was time for her to face the consequences. Inside the hotel, Hank barely registered the front desk clerk's polite nod as he passed. His eyes were fixed on the elevator. Room 212. His pulse thundered in his ears as he punched the button, and the door slid shut behind him. The elevator ascended slowly, tortuously, and each floor that ticked by brought him closer to the confrontation he had played out in his mind 100 times. When the doors opened, Hank stepped out into the hallway, his heart a hammer against his ribs. He found room 212 easily enough, second door on the left. For a moment, he stood there, just breathing, gathering every last ounce of control. He could hear muffled voices inside, Jenna's laugh mingling with Tom's deeper tone. It twisted the knife of betrayal in his gut even more. He raised his hand to knock but hesitated. Part of him, a small, weak part, wanted to turn around to pretend he didn't know, to avoid the finality of what was about to happen. But that part quickly died as he clenched his fist and pounded on the door, harder than he'd intended. The voices inside fell silent. There was a brief pause, followed by footsteps approaching the door. Hank's heart slammed in his chest as the door creaked open. Tom stood there shirtless, his eyes widening in recognition. "Hank?" Tom's voice wavered with shock. What are you doing here?" Without saying a word, Hank stepped forward, forcing Tom back into the room. Jenna was sitting on the edge of the bed, wearing nothing but a hotel bathrobe. Her face turned ashen the moment she saw Hank. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Hank, it's not what it looks like," Jenna stammered, standing up, clutching the robe tighter around her. "I swear, it's not." "Stop." Hank's voice was deadly calm, even as every nerve in his body screamed. "Don't even bother lying. I know everything." Jenna's eyes darted to Tom as if he could somehow help her, but Tom looked as shell-shocked as she did, backing away toward the corner of the room. "I've been watching you for weeks," Hank continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward Jenna. "I've seen the texts, the videos, all of it. You've been lying to me this whole time, and now you want to stand there and tell me this isn't what it looks like." Jenna's face crumpled, and she sank back onto the bed, tears welling up in her eyes. "Hank, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to what?" Hank's voice rose, finally cracking under the strain. "Didn't mean to cheat. I didn't mean to lie to my face every single day, or didn't mean to get caught." She broke into sobs, her words tumbling out in gasps. "It was a mistake. I never wanted to hurt you." Tom, still standing in the corner, cleared his throat as if he were about to say something, but Hank's glare silenced him. Hank pointed toward the door. "Get out." Tom blinked. "Hank, listen." "I said get out," Hank growled, his voice dangerously low. Tom didn't need to be told again. He scrambled to grab his shirt, slipping out of the room as fast as he could. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Hank and Jenna alone in the aftermath of her betrayal. So silence that filled the room after Tom left was suffocating. Jenna sat on the edge of the bed, tears streaming down her face, but Hank felt nothing as he looked at her. No sympathy, no compassion, just a cold, hollow emptiness where love had once been. Though he had imagined this moment for days, rehearsed every word, but now that it was here, he felt numb, drained. Jenna sobbed softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Hank, please, I didn't want it to get this far. You didn't want it to get this far." Hank cut her off, his tone sharp. "Jenna, you've been lying to me for months. Do you think that's something that just happens by accident? You didn't fall into his arms, you chose this." She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Hank watched her for a moment, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface, but he kept it in check. He had to stay calm. He wasn't here to scream or throw things. He was here to end it. "I want you to listen carefully," he said, his voice hard. Jenna looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. Tomorrow, you're going to get divorce papers. You're going to sign them without a fight. You're going to walk away from this marriage with nothing, no alimony, no claim to the house, nothing." Jenna's breath hitched, and for the first time, Hank saw real fear in her eyes. "Hank, wait," she pleaded, standing up from the bed. "We can work this out. Please, I'll do anything. I love you." "Don't." Hank's voice was cold and final. "You don't get to say that. You don't love me, Jenna. Not after what you've done. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." Jenna shook her head, stepping closer, reaching out as if to touch him. "I do love you, Hank. I was confused. I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean I don't love you. Please, we can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can." Hank took a step back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Counseling? For what? You've been screwing your boss for months. Do you think talking to some therapist is going to erase that? What do you think I'm going to forget the pictures, the messages, the fact that you've been laughing at me behind my back with him?" She crumbled, collapsing back onto the bed, her sobs growing louder. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." But Hank didn't care. He was past caring. The woman sitting in front of him wasn't his wife anymore. She was a stranger, a liar. He pulled the ring off his finger, the cold metal suddenly feeling like a dead weight, and tossed it onto the bed next to her. "It's over, Jenna. There's nothing left to save." Jenna stared at the ring, her hand trembling as she reached for it, clutching it in her fist. "Please, I can't lose you." "But you already did." Hank's voice was flat, emotionless. He turned his back on her and walked toward the door. "I'll send someone to pick up the rest of my things. Don't be here when I get back." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need to. As he opened the door, a wave of bitter relief washed over him. It was done. The years of marriage, the memories, the promises, it was all gone, shattered by her betrayal. The hallway outside the hotel room felt surreal, like he was walking through a bad dream. His mind buzzed with a mix of emotions, anger, pain, and a sense of freedom he hadn't expected. But the sadness lingered, deep and heavy. As he reached the elevator, Hank's phone buzzed again. It was the private investigator. "Oh, we've got everything we need. Pictures, videos, conversations. Let me know if you want me to send them over." Hank stared at the screen for a moment before typing back, "No, I don't need them. It's done." He slipped the phone into his pocket, feeling the finality of those words. It was done. Everything he thought his life was, the marriage, the love, the future he'd imagined, was gone. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Hank didn't feel powerless. He had taken control. But he had ended it on his terms. Now it was time to rebuild what was left of his life without Jenna. Hank drove aimlessly after leaving the hotel, the city lights blurring past his windshield as his thoughts spiraled. The confrontation had been explosive, yes, but it had left him feeling empty. He had always thought that exposing Jenna's lies, confronting her at the usual humiliating light of truth, would bring some sense of justice or satisfaction. But now that it was done, he just felt hollow. He pulled into a parking lot of a nearby park and killed the engine, sitting in the dark with only the distant hum of the city for company. He needed to process what had just happened. The memories of their life together flashed before his eyes like scenes from a movie: their wedding day, laughing together in the kitchen, lazy Sunday mornings spent wrapped in each other's arms. All of it seemed so distant now, tainted by the knowledge of her betrayal. How could it have come to this? He wondered bitterly, running his hands through his hair. He felt stupid for not seeing the signs earlier. The late nights, the sudden business trips, the way Jenna had gradually become more distant. He had chalked it up to stress, to life getting in the way, to the ebb and flow of a long marriage. But now it was clear it had been slipping away from him for months, and he had been too blind to see it. His phone buzzed, cutting through the silence. He glanced at the screen. It was Mike, the friend who had sent him the photos of Jenna and Tom in the first place. "How'd it go? You okay?" the message read. Hank stared at the words for a long time before replying, "It's done. I left her." A few moments passed before Mike responded, "I'm sorry, man. You did what you had to do. You want to grab a drink or something?" Hank thought about it, about drowning his pain in alcohol and meaningless conversation, but he shook his head. That wasn't what he needed right now. What he needed was space to think, to clear his head, to figure out how to rebuild his life from the ashes Jenna had left behind. "Not tonight," Hank replied. "I need some time." And Mike didn't press him, just sent back a simple, "I get it. Let me know if you need anything." Hank put the phone down and leaned back in his seat, staring up at the stars through the windshield. For a moment, he wondered if Jenna was still at the hotel, or had she already gone running back to Tom. It didn't matter. She was no longer his concern. As the minutes ticked by, Hank found himself thinking about the future. He had never imagined life without Jenna. For years, she had been his partner, the woman he thought he'd grow old with, the mother of his children they'd never had. He had built his life around her, and now with her gone, there was nothing left to hold on to. But maybe that was a good thing. Maybe starting over wasn't the worst outcome. He'd been living in the shadow of her lies for too long. Now he had the chance to rebuild, to create something new, something better. Hank didn't know what that would look like. Not yet. He didn't know how long it would take to heal or if he would ever fully trust someone again. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let Jenna's betrayal define him. She had destroyed their marriage, but she wouldn't destroy him. He took a deep breath, started the car again, and pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward home. It wasn't going to be easy, nothing about this would be, but Hank was ready to start picking up the pieces of his shattered life, one step at a time. As he drove through the quiet streets, he realized something else. For the first time in months, he felt in control. Jenna had taken so much from him, but she couldn't take his future. That was his and his alone. Whatever came next, Hank would face it head on, and he wouldn't let anyone, especially not Jenna, stand in his way again. Hank returned home late that night. The photos on the walls of him and Jenna, smiling in happier times, now felt like cruel reminders of a life that no longer existed. He thought about taking them down, but instead, he simply turned away from them, heading into the kitchen. He grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat at the dining table, the place where so many conversations had unfolded between him and Jenna, so many plans for the future. He stared at the empty seat across from him, the one where she used to sit, laughing, sharing stories about her day. But now, that seat would stay empty, a ghost of the woman who had shattered his heart. He popped the cap off the bottle and took a long drink, letting the bitterness of the alcohol match the bitterness inside him. He felt numb, almost detached from the reality of what had happened earlier. He had confronted her, had told her it was over. He had taken the first step toward reclaiming his life. But it still felt surreal, like he was walking through someone else's nightmare. His phone buzzed again, but he didn't bother looking at it this time. He didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to explain how he felt or relive the confrontation with Jenna. He just wanted to be alone, to sit in the quiet and try to make sense of the wreckage of his life. But as he sat there, the silence began to close in on him, pressing against his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. The house, once a place of comfort and warmth, now felt cold and suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator felt amplified in the empty space. It was unbearable. Nay, he couldn't stay there. Grabbing his keys, Hank walked back out to his car, not entirely sure where he was going, but knowing he needed to get away, to escape the memories that haunted every corner of his home. He drove through the quiet streets, aimlessly at first, until he found himself heading toward the outskirts of town, where the roads opened up and the lights of the city began to fade behind him. Eventually, he pulled off onto a dirt road that led to a small lake, a place he hadn't been to in years. It was where he and Jenna used to come early in their marriage, back when they couldn't afford fancy vacations, but still wanted to get away from it all. They'd pack a picnic, sit by the water, and talk for hours about their dreams, their plans for the future. Now, those memories felt like a cruel joke. Hank parked the car and got out, the cool night air hitting his skin as he walked down toward the water's edge. The moon reflected off the surface of the lake, casting a pale, ghostly glow over everything. He stood there for a long time, staring out at the water, letting the quiet of the night wash over him. He thought about Jenna, about how different things could have been if she hadn't chosen to betray him. They could have been happy, could have grown old together like they had once dreamed. But all of that was gone now, destroyed by her lies. He wondered if she was still at the hotel, still crying, still trying to make sense of her life without him. He doubted it. She would probably run back to Tom, try to patch together whatever was left of that affair. But Hank didn't care anymore. He was done with her, done with the pain. For the first time in days, Hank let himself cry. He stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, and let the tears fall. He cried for the love he'd lost, for the life he thought he'd have, for the years he had spent building something that turned out to be nothing but lies. The pain of it all was overwhelming, crashing over him like a wave that pulled him under, but he didn't fight it. He let it take him, let himself drown in the sorrow. When the tears finally stopped, Hank wiped his face and looked out at the lake again. The surface was calm, the water still and quiet, as if the world itself had been waiting for him to release the pain. In that moment, he felt a strange sense of peace, as if the weight of the betrayal had finally lifted, leaving him with nothing but a clean slate. It was over, truly over. Hank took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool, fresh air, and slowly exhaled. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time he wasn't afraid of it. He had survived the worst. He had faced Jenna, faced the lies, and walked away with his dignity intact. He had been broken, but now he had a chance to rebuild, to start again. The idea didn't scare him anymore. In fact, it felt liberating. Hank turned away from the lake and started back toward his car. As he drove back toward the city, toward whatever his future held, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope? He didn't know what would come next, but he knew one thing: he was going to be okay. He was going to find a way to move forward, one step at a time, and build a life that was his own, free from the lies, free from the betrayal, and free from Jenna. And that was enough. For now, that was enough.